Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Shreya Kaushik, and I'm the program lead for responsible finance at Oxfam India and also the lead for Fair Finance India. I'd like to thank each one of you for joining us this afternoon for this technical session on adopting sustainable finance and making the business case for ESG investing. Very briefly, I would like to give a brief of what Fair Finance India is. It's a civil society initiative that seeks to strengthen the commitment of financial institutions towards various social, environmental, and human rights issues. And it is essentially there to promote transparency and responsibility in the Indian banking sector and support its own sustainability. We are very happy to co-curate this session with Access. The session will be moderated by Mr. Shankar Venkateshwaran, who is the co-founder and head for the EQ Climate Finance and also the board chair for Oxfam India. The panelists include Mr. Royston Braganza, CEO Grameen Capital India, Ms. Wei Yuan, Asia Lead for Sustainable Banking Network, and Mr. Arindam Datta, EDN Head for Rural Development Banking at Rabobank. We look forward to this insightful discussion, and I request the audience to please feel free to put their questions in the chat box. And with this, Shankar, I hand over the session to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all the participants. I understand there are several from places outside of India, so welcome to this session on adopting sustainable finance and making the business case for ESG investing. So I have a great panel with us today. As Shreya briefly introduced, we have Wei Yuan from IFC, Arindam from Rabobank, and Royston from Grameen Capital. And what I'm going to do is to basically give the floor to them because they are the experts. But let me just start with some opening remarks on the state of play of ESG, particularly in India, but also trying to look at it more broadly. One of the interesting encounters I remember having with an investor from a large financial institution a couple of years ago was that he told me that investors are driven by fundamentally two emotions. So he said that the two emotions are fear and greed. And fear is what results in them looking at risk, and any form of risk is what feeds into the fear emotion, and all opportunities to make money feed into the greed emotion. So that's a very interesting. He had a very interesting perspective on how investors look at it. And when you look at it, when you put ESG into the mix, you can see how it plays into both. And I think there's an increasing realization globally that ESG factors, the environmental, social, and governance factors, contribute both to the risk of an investment or a lending, as well as the opportunities to sort of create wealth and increase GDP and all and economic growth. So ESG is certainly the new kid on the block, so to speak. But having said that, I think there is increasing evidence globally that it is not something peripheral anymore. It may have been that 15, 20 years ago. It is certainly not peripheral now. And there is increasing evidence that shows that ESG is very central to the way the financial institutions look at their operations. So if you look at something called the UN Principles of Responsible Investing, it has so many thousands of members who are members of PRI, who basically sign on to PRI saying that they would use responsible investing, ESG principles in the way they invest, and they control over $80 trillion the assets under management with them. And I think there was a study that was done a few years ago which McKinsey had done, which showed that about $30 trillion have been deployed in ESG, keeping ESG in the center of how the investment happens. So it is clearly very mainstream. If you start looking at all the major global reporting frameworks, whether it is CDP, whether it is GRI, integrated reporting, TCFD, all of them fundamentally are coming from the investor lens. It's investors who are saying we need to know more about what is happening, and we need to know more about an ESG dimension to this. So clearly, ESG is no longer peripheral. It is very much mainstream. It is driving the way investments and lending happens going forward. So that, I don't think there's any two ways about it. In the Indian context too, it is clearly becoming mainstream. I can certainly tell you about my own personal journey. I've been working with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs for the last 10 years on trying to get sustainability, responsible business, ESG onto the main agenda. So some of you may have heard of something called the National Voluntary Guidelines, which were put out in 2011, where I had the privilege of being part of the drafting committee, which led to something called the Business Responsibility Report that SEBI mandated initially for the top 100 companies, then the 500, and now the top 1,000 listed companies. We have a new version of the NVGs called the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct. Again, I had the privilege of being part of drafting that. And we have a companion reporting framework called the Business Sustainability and Responsibility Report, which SEBI has put out for public consultation. So you can see that even in India, there is that increasing understanding that this is core to how we need to run our business, to run for the country to be on that path to sort of sustainable development going forward. And all this, of course, links very closely with the SDGs, and we're going to have our panelists speak to that. So what we're going to try and do in the next hour and a bit that we have is try and get our panelists to contribute their own thoughts, their experiences to some of the kind of questions that we want to tease out. So what is the role of the financial community in promoting ESGs? So we will hear from our panelists on their thoughts on that. What is the business case? Why does it make business sense for the financial institutions to put ESG into the core of how they go about doing their work, whether it is lending, whether it is investing? We will try and understand some of those trends there, some of those experiences there from our panelists. We were hoping to have one or two regulators on the panel. We could not, they were not available. But again, our panelists have been dealing with regulators a lot, and we will try and tease out some of those experiences also. So while we speak to the panel, and I'm going to put them questions to them for which we will seek their responses, I urge you, as Shreya said, to keep putting your questions and comments on the chat box. We have a team behind who will sort of compile them together, and at appropriate points, we will lead them to the panelists. So with that, let me start with you, Wei. So I think, the work that you do with IFC is very, very interesting because it is Asia-wide. And I think let me start from that perspective. Global and Asia sort of perspective, what are you seeing in terms of trends in ESG investing? Where is that whole agenda headed from your vantage point? Right, for you.
Yeah, thank you, Shankar, for that very good opening remarks. I think that very well set the stage for this discussion. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wei Yuan. I work with IFC's ESG department. And the team I wish ESG advisory services. Just from my perspective, I've been seeing two interesting kind of a ESG trend at two levels. One is through our advisory services. We've been working across Asia with the financial market regulators and central banks and banking associations for market level sustainable finance policy guideline development or voluntary standards development, which is usually then led by the banking association. We're also working on market capacity building, on ESG integration. This is pretty much focused on the banking industry, and also supporting individual financial institutions, again, focus on the banks in adopting international best practices on environmental social risk management and ESG integration. So this is the country-based program being involved in across Asia in multiple countries. At the global level, through the Sustainable Banking Network, this captures a bit of a global trend. This is a network, again, of central banks, banking regulators, and banking associations from the emerging market, because IFC's mandate is only to work with the emerging market. It was when it was first set up in 2012, it was a small network of like-minded financial market regulators saying, why don't we just form a kind of a knowledge network to start understand sustainable finance? It was 10 countries, mostly from actually East Asia, including China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mongolia, Philippines, and Thailand at the time. Now, last week we just welcomed another new member from this region, from South Asia, Maldives Monetary Authority. So that's the 42nd country joining the SBN network. So the network has expanded significantly. And just a quick numbers, overall, this is 59 members, including, because from some countries, it's like more than one member. Some of the stock exchanges are also joining from 42 countries. And collectively, those members can impact banking assets of over 43 trillion US dollars. And that represents about 86% of all the banking assets across emerging markets. Not all members at the same development stage. We have a global report to capture member progress. As of the 2019 result, 22 countries have introduced national sustainable finance guidelines or policies or framework, different types of documents, either regulatory or voluntary. But in this region, Asia, we're seeing a lot of regulator-driven action. There seems to be a preference for regulator-driven actions in Asia. Well, in Latin America, we clearly see a trend of a more market-based approach led by banking associations. So there's huge progress over the past, 5 to 8 years. I guess I'll just stop here, and then happy to take questions or continue a next round of discussion.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Wei. We'll come back to you, but I think that was a very good, broad sweep of where we are. And I think it was interesting that you mentioned about how the Asian region likes regulators to play a more active role. So we should come back to that and discuss that a little bit more going forward. So we'll do that. Royston, may I turn to you? First, perhaps you can just give us a overview of what Grameen Capital does, just to so that we all know. Some of us have, of course, heard of you, but maybe many of the participants haven't. So that might give us a good starting point, and then we will get into some more questions on that.
Thanks so much, Shankar, and it's a pleasure being here. You started with a personal journey, and and how you sort of moved right up there with the MCA and with SEBI and all these amazing things that you're doing. My journey, unfortunately, is pretty much the opposite. While you go up the corporate ladder, I keep coming down. So started in Citibank with corporate bank, then investment bank, then mid-market, then SME, then HSBC with microfinance, now Grameen with rock bottom. So I've been coming right down the corporate ladder, unlike people like Arindam and you, and I'm sure Wei, who's been growing and going from one level of glory to the next. But it's been quite a fascinating journey. And when we started Grameen Capital, to answer your question, the dream was, how do we build? It was just after Professor Yunus had won the Nobel Peace Prize. And we were saying, what can we do in India? There are 400 million people, less than $2 a day. How do we help them to access, mainstream sources of formal sources of funding? And one thing we decided not to do was to start an MFI. The most sort of intuitive thing would have been to do and create an MFI, because that's what Grameen is known for globally. But Grameen Foundation, who's our founder shareholder, decided and sort of did not resist my suggestion that we create an entity that actually works with about 100 NGOs that were already in existence at that time. Because we felt that if we have to reach 400 million people, it will take us more than a lifetime. But if we can do it with collaborators and partners and help them to scale, it would happen much quicker. So we actually worked with them, and at that time, even Bandhan was an NGO. So people like Bandhan, Jan Lakshmi, Ujjivan, Disha. So help them, many of them transition from NGO to for-profit to NBFC, NBFC to SFB or small finance banks. And of course, Bandhan became a mainstream bank. So that journey really was the journey from 2008 to 18 of helping to mainstream microfinance. In my role as the chair of Sadhan, when I finished my term 2 years ago, we had reached 52 million clients. So in some ways, if you take 6 members to a household, you're already 300 million people served. So to that extent, we said, how do we bring it to the mainstream? And you talked about, I like the words you used. I want to keep picking on some of the points you made in your opening comments. You talked about ESG as the new kid on the block. And in some ways, microfinance is the old kid on the block. And what I would like to do over the next, hour or so that we have is see the learnings that we have from the old kid on the block so that we don't end up reinventing the wheel, making the same mistakes, and can really build on some of the lessons that we have. And so in a way, I'll just sort of close with that and before we go into the next round. But we said, how can we bring those learnings to what we call the adjacent spaces? Because the same household needs affordable health, it needs affordable education, it needs clean water, it needs sanitation, it needs clean energy, it needs agri solutions. So we said, let's create Grameen Impact as an entity to work, because this was now becoming fashionably called impact investing. And it flopped. And the reason it flopped is that Grameen Capital was able to connect capital pools with the demand from social enterprises. But in the case of these impact sectors, there were no capital pools at all. So as you talked about regulators, the priority sector definition sort of was the big plus that helped microfinance to scale up. Whereas we found banks who would rather do 500 crores to Bandhan than do 5 crores to 100 social enterprises. So that really was, how do we bring capital to the smaller social enterprises? And that created in us the clarity that, just building a social investment bank was good for microfinance, but that same model wouldn't work in the impact sector, in affordable health, education, water, sanitation, clean energy, and agri. So we said, so we talked to the social enterprises and they said, what we would really like is if you can do debt. Because equity, we can at least have reasonable visibility. People like Way and IFC and, Avishkar and Lok and a lot of funds are providing equity to social enterprises in India. But debt is very constrained. And so we created Grameen Impact. We acquired an NBFC license and we began to lend to these social enterprises. And what we realized, and I'll sort of come back to a point where you talked about ESG at 30 trillion, it's exactly the same number when I was addressing the UN General Assembly, which is the gap in SDG financing. There is a global gap of $30 trillion. Now, how do we bring that type? And India probably needs 5 to 10 trillion of that global 30 trillion pot. So how do we bring mainstream capital to work in ESG? How do we bring it to work for the SDGs? In some ways, the ESG seems to be, and SDG seem to be two ways of looking at the same animal. The large funds, the BlackRocks and the KKRs and the Bains and the Goldmans put on an ESG lens and look at the large corporates. And people like Arindam and I put on an SDG lens and look at the smaller enterprises. And there's sort of, it's the same elephant, but just viewed with different perspectives. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. And we'll just come back to that, especially as you said, is it the same thing, just looked at differently with different letters? I think that's something that will be interesting to talk about. And by the way, I completely disagree with you about the way you describe the trajectory. It's completely the opposite of what you're saying. So please, we'll talk about that offline at some other point of time. Arindam, let me come to you. And again, welcome to this session. So I think it'll again be useful for all of us in the session to get a better hang of what you do at Rabobank. What is the kind of work that Rabobank does, which sort of which will provide the context for a little bit more conversation around the topic of ESG and its relevance to you. So if you could just start with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Shankar. Thanks to the Access team for inviting me to speak in this very interesting panel. and panelists like Royston. Rabobank, it's a Dutch cooperative bank. Huh? It's the largest cooperative financial institution in the world. And interestingly, it's also the largest financial institution in the food and agri-business space. But more importantly for this conversation, it is the world's #1 rated sustainability bank as rated by Sustainalytics. Huh? And I wear two hats, and one of the hats I wear is looking after all the sustainability based businesses in this part of the world. And so the way I look at it, there are four legs. Huh? Uh, to put things in a very simple context, the first is knowledge. What exactly does sustainability mean? It's a tough question. It's a tough answer because it's a very evolving subject. Every day we are learning more as to what is sustainability because there are many, many sectors. Now, what does sustainability mean in the sugar sector? What does it mean in the construction sector? What are the benchmarks out there? And from a banking perspective, what is sustainability banking? So these norms and benchmarks are evolving by the day. So first pillar is knowledge. The second and most important, and that was alluded to by you, Shankar, is about risk management. Now, it's important for anybody who provides capital to not only understand the financial risk, but also to understand the non-financial risk that the business is carrying. That is this business going to exist 10 years hence? That business may not exist because of regulatory risk, because the markets may reject this business, and there could be so many other risks, which is not covered in a typical financial risk analysis. So risk management is very, very important. And third, to take forward the point from Royston, that is sustainability financing a profitable business? Now, if we look at the global investor and we look at both the debt and equity providers, now it's still evolving, but the early data shows us that the sustainable companies which are rated and ranked very high are also the best performing companies so far as financial performance is concerned. So to some extent, this hypothesis that a sustainable company will outlast a non-sustainable company, or they would be there for a larger period of time and your capital would be protected, it's proving to be true. We still need more data on that. The third is about business development. So all financial institutions, they look for new avenues to invest in, and to invest in sustainability products to sustainable business is big business out there. And the fourth and very, very important is about reporting. Unless you know what you're doing and you can report credibly to your internal and external stakeholders and be audited and held responsible, it doesn't mean anything. So the four legs I would say is knowledge, risk management, business development, and reporting. Now, why sustainability financing? Now, it's important that firstly, we all know that Mother Earth has its own limitation, that unless we do a business in a responsible manner, that we are going to leave behind a world which is going to be extremely difficult for our future generations. So that's one. But second is regulation, as we mentioned, is coming on very heavily on different kind of businesses, on different kind of financing across the world. And third is consumer preference and market preferences. If you look at any of the multinational companies which are reaching out to markets across the world, and if they touch on the European or US markets, they are perforce asked to report on ESG, SDG, or other sustainability parameters. That's because the investors there are extremely demanding, because in turn, their investors are asking tough questions of, is our money, which is being deployed through you, is it leading to any kind of negative consequences for society and for Mother Earth? So these are the tough questions which are being asked. And now it's being formalized through different kind of networks to define what sustainability, responsibility banking is. And it's growing, but I would still say that Europe and the US are far ahead of the Asia story and the India story as of now. I'll stop here for the time being, Shankar.
Yeah, thanks, Arvind. Well, perhaps we should come back to that as to why that is the case, why Europe and North America are ahead of the game. But I think that's a good segue into actually posing that question to Wei, to you, So one of the differences you mentioned that happens in Asia compared to the rest of the world is that here we look to the regulators to sort of push this agenda. And I'm just wondering what is whether there is some insights that you have based on your experience, especially in your conversations that you have in the sustainable banking network, as to why this is the case. What is the sort of trigger points for ESG thinking in Asia, and how do regulators, or how are regulators beginning to think about it, and how is it different from the rest of the world? So any insights on that would be very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Shankar. I think that's a really good question. I'm just thinking, we've developed, the SBN community has developed 2 global progress reports where we've been tracking, having one-to-one interviews with the regulators, with our members, banking associations, to understand the momentum driver for sustainable finance across different emerging markets. Well, one one data would be is that across a lot of the emerging markets, definitely in Asia, I'm more familiar with the East Asia market, Mongolia, China, Vietnam, Indonesia. These are the countries, when you look at the market, local banks actually provide bulk of the financing, meet the local financing needs. It's usually at the level of in China, this is between 70 to 80% local financing needs is provided by the banks rather than the capital market. And then in Mongolia, this is as high as 90%, and also around 90% in Indonesia. So, across all those markets, it's usually with the banking sector that the sustainable banking started ahead of overall sustainable finance. Where in European, definitely is, Andrew can share more on that. It's an institutional investors market, where you usually start from a capital market perspective for ESG integration. Well, in those East Asian countries where we've been working closely with, it starts with the banking industry. And then banking is a heavily regulated industry, as you know. This is where the banking regulators have a strong influence on everything. I think that partly explains why we're seeing the regulatory-led approach. My team is actually more focused on the risk perspective. When we talk about sustainable finance, when we develop the report, we have put the whole analysis into 2 lenses. One on the risk side, one on opportunity side. So for risk side, you basically put managing of environmental and social risks. Environmental risks range from pollution issues. These are the sub-project, project level risks, but they can be passed on to investors into the local financial institutions, and of course, for the financial institutions themselves. So, and then on the opportunity side, these are lending green finance, lending to renewables, lending to also meet increasingly some of the social needs. So we see this in 2 lenses for the bank's operation. Risk, this is medium and back office operations. And then for the lending side, that's the front office operations. So from a risk perspective, we're also seeing a strong push from the regulators. So this is usually what the country is on 2 fronts. On the pollution side, accelerating, intensifying its environmental overall enforcement. Then that creates a driver for financial institutions to wanting to protect its portfolio. And then increasingly, after the Paris Agreement, climate risk kicks in. There's a lot of climate related considerations. I wouldn't elaborate on that. There's a lot of discussions on that front. So, just to summarize, you can see a strong regulation-linked push, and then fundamentally it's linked to the local financial market composition, where it's a banking-heavy financial markets.
Okay, but I think what you're also saying, which is very interesting, is that it's banking-led, and banks are the very, very heavily regulated. So there is that element of regulation. But what you're also saying is the regulation that is pushing the borrowers themselves, which then has an impact on the lenders to also look at these kinds of issues. So whether it's pollution-related regulations on companies that are doing whatever they are, and so the banks are then have to look at that as a risk into the way they themselves do the lending. Yeah, so it's on multiple fronts that regulation plays a role, and that's an interesting insight. I was just wondering, just if I can just stay with you for another short question, which is again on the SPN. What kinds of conversations happen on ESG? I mean, is it something which is a sort of a sidebar, or is it something more core? Is it becoming more core as a conversation in your meetings and interactions?
It's that's an evolving kind of agenda. When the network was first formed in 2012, the focus of the discussion is pretty much on traditional environmental risk management for banks. That's when sustainable finance was pretty new concept for most emerging market countries. So at that stage, we've been working at the time with regulators in most East Asian countries, Mongolia, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. These are the 5 countries that IFC started to work at the country level. The discussion at the time was different regulators have different approach, but overall they want banks to start to understand environmental social issues and how this can potentially affect their portfolio. From a risk management perspective, you can see the regulator usually come in with a risk management perspective, wanting to protect the overall financial market resilience and protect the bank's overall portfolio, making sure it's a sound portfolio, healthy portfolio. And then they don't want to rush the agenda at the time. So it's more focused on banks having systems, banks having strategy, overall overarching. So board is aware of the importance of this issue. And the senior management started to be asking questions for their portfolio officer, for their credit officer to look into those issues. So it's more like a corporate governance structure change for ESG integration in that. And then gradually they feel more comfortable with this, and they feel the banks are building up their procedures and process. They start to put in place reporting requirements. These are sustainability performance reporting requirements. Indonesia is a good example. Their financial market regulator put in a guideline for sustainability reporting requirements for all financial institutions beyond banks, because OJK's kind of regular scope of coverage is beyond banking industry. So it also covers capital market and pension fund and the insurance industry. And then gradually start to move to include a more incentive, encouraging financial innovation, lending to renewables, lending to small mini hydro projects. And so this kind of innovation side encourage, but this is usually not done through guidelines, because I mean, regulators just want to send signals. So these are the potential sector you should be looking into. And recently, it started to shift more towards climate risk consideration. But this is definitely very new. I'm sure you have all heard of the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System. This is led by the French Central Bank, and also now is a kind of a growing network for central bankers. The focus is very much on environmental risk, but focus on climate risk consideration from a central bank perspective. So this is a good, if you look over the past 8 to 9 years, is really evolving priorities for the regulators.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so it is a journey, and I guess I know it'll be interesting to hear from both Royston and Arindam how you see that playing out in India. But we'll come to that. Royston, I want to come to you, and interesting that you said that ESG and SDG are basically 2 sides of the same coin, which they are indeed. At the end of the day, I think the financial institution, the financial sector likes to, like any other sector, likes to create its own jargon. So ESG is that kind of jargon. But I just wanted to know how it plays out. And it is interesting when we heard from V about the focus on environment that was there in East Asia, and a lot of what you do in Grameen, I guess, focuses on the more on the S part than on the E part, because that's the nature of what you do. But I'm just wondering, how does this play out? How do SDGs sort of inform the way you go about doing what you do? And how do you sort of look at E and S and G in the context of your work and linking that up with SDGs?
So we started by saying ESG and SDG look similar, and then Arindam threw a new word in the mix called sustainability financing, which again is similar. And we talked about the greening of the financial system. So it's true that each one's sort of coming at it like the different men who looked at the elephant. But I think it's important for us to recognize the elephant in the room and outside, but more importantly, to make sure that each one's doing the segment that we're looking at with sort of impeccable focus. Last night, I was on a call with Nick Donahoe on what they call Just Transition. Now, Just Transition is going to lead about $2 billion of investing from the CD. We are all talking the same thing. It's just that, and I remember this because I don't know if you know Pierre Gramigné, who was the finance minister for Luxembourg, and he was, he invited me to speak at the Sustainability Finance Forum as a keynote speaker, and they had listed, I think, a $500 million green bond on the green exchange. And, I told him it's a bit embarrassing because, you're talking about $500 million of investing on a bond, and here we are doing a $500,000 bond, so putting me up there. And, he reminded me, he said that, many years ago, 30 years ago, Professor Yunus came up with a loan, but with many zeros removed, and called it a micro loan. And what you're doing effectively is doing a bond, but many zeros removed and doing a micro bond. And therefore, it sort of got me thinking that I don't need to do a $100 million bond or a $500 million bond. I would be happier doing $1 million bond and 500 of them. And therefore, that's where Arindam comes in to support me as the banker, and Way comes in to support me as a equity investor in my NBFC. I'm doing a subtle pitch to both of you. But the fact is that that's exactly what we want to build. We want to build an SDG bond engine where we are creating micro bonds for an entity that's doing solar panels, an entity that's doing plastic collection, an entity that's doing livelihood training, an entity that's doing agri-tech. And we've done that. So literally what we did was in 2018 at the General Assembly, people were talking, really large numbers and big ways to approach SDG and ESG and talking about impact bonds. And each of these bonds were taking 2 to 3 years to get done. And I said, why not challenge this hypothesis and say, can we do it in 2 to 3 months rather than 2 to 3 years? What is taking time? And what was taking time is just an inefficient process, because we were looking for an impact investor, then an implementing partner, then an outcome funder, then an evaluating agency. And when you found one, the other one escaped. When you went searching for that one, this first one ran off. So that process was making the middleman rich and the lawyers rich, because they kept rewriting, the bond MOUs. But what was ending up in terms of money coming in as outcome funding was getting lost along the way. And so we said, let's create micro bonds and do it in 3 months. And literally, Shankar, from September 2018, every 3 months we've done an impact bond. We did the first one on Goal 5 on women's empowerment with 2,000 tribal women in rural Madhya Pradesh to become poultry farmers. Small $1 million bond, got that done. And we define the outcomes when we give the money. And through the life of the bond, 18 months, 24 months, and that's where I need your help in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Because in that process, we want to say, who is interested? Which CSR is interested in 2,000 women becoming empowered? So Johnson & Johnson, Unilever say, yes, that's something that I want to do anyway. So then if these 2,000 are trained, would you then pay the coupon for those social enterprises? So they get an effective zero coupon bond. Or in 3 months from there, we did a Goal 8 bond on livelihoods and skilling for 20,000 youths to be trained and skilled. 3 months from then, we did a Goal 5 and 8 combination to make women weavers, creating their own line of rugs and dharis and carpets. We then did another bond on Goal 7 and where you'll be interested in this on solar energy and renewable energy, for companies to drop the cost of the energy through an impact bond. Then we did one on a COVID impact bond for women livelihoods, so that we could repurpose the skills of artisans to be able to make masks and sanitizers. And now, with Arindam's blessings and good wishes, we are working on a Goal 2 agri bond, where we're working with agri-tech companies in the cold chain, in the distribution, in the technology solutions to be able to pivot. So that's really what we want to do. We want to, right now we're doing it off our balance sheet, to your point, Shankar, in terms of how do we scale this. And so it's $1 million each. But next year, I want to do 10x of each one of them, because in India, the good thing is we always have enough of scale available to us. So that's when I will bring in co-investors to invest, and it then becomes a bond really in its truest sense. Right now, it's more a loan. But year 3, again, Shankar, is where I'm going to draw from your expertise and connections, is where, and we're working with Madam Sitaraman on the social stock exchange. Year 3, we want to do 100x. And so we want to list those $100 million bonds on a social stock exchange. And that's when we want to democratize funding access. So the path is very clear in my mind. But my mind is not, is not the way it should end. We need to be able to bring this to market. We need to be able to create those products. We need to be able to catalyze capital. And that's where, the traction from many people come in. So it doesn't really matter, are you looking at an ESG lens or an SDG lens or a sustainable finance lens? Because on these 17 goals, everything is there. Within each 17 goals, there are 169 indicators if you add them up. Each of these indicators can be outcomes. So we are able to distill in a very clear manner, and corporates are excited about these goals. Governments are excited about these goals. So why are we creating new taxonomy for everything? Why are we reinventing the wheel for everything? Why does RBI have a list of priority sector lending, which is different from SEBI's social venture capital fund definition, which is different from MCA's rules under Section 135, which is different from... Everyone's creating their own list. When do we stop? I'm going to go blue in my face trying to say this at every place. Let's build one set, probably something that 193 countries have signed up on, and then make this your list of PSL for RBI, and make this your list for CSR, and make this your list for SVCF and SEBI, so that we're all talking off the same script and singing off the same music sheet. I'll stop there.
Yeah, but I think the good news is that I think the music that you've been singing and playing is being heard, because certainly I can say for the national guidelines, when we were putting it together, we were very much looking at alignment with the SDGs, and so the BRSR was aligned with the SDGs. So I think so SDGs in that sense becomes a very interesting central framework around which we play this. But just to sort of take it a bit one step forward in terms of what you said, deployment of the funds that you get. So am I right in hearing you say that the outcomes that you're asking from your borrowers or your investees is sort of defined in SDG terms? Is that the way you ask them to, or you at least report on the outcomes that you're trying to seek from them?
So we ask them for outcomes that are germane to their business. So for example, if I'm looking at a dairy company, then I will talk about the number of dairy farmers. I will talk about the productivity. I will talk about the milk percentage saved. If I'm looking at plastics, then I will look at plastic tonnage collection or waste reduction and CO2 emission reduction. If I'm looking at vocation skilling, I'm looking at number of hours trained, number of placements, number of months on the job before counting it as a successful placement. So we don't want to complicate that. That's one thing Grameen has learned in microfinance. You can't complicate the life of the end borrower. They have to do what they do, and they do it well. So we then, reclassify them, and Arindam and I and his team in the Netherlands would categorize it and say, how do these really fit? What are the learnings? Where do they fit in within the SDGs? Is it 7? Is it 13? Is it 12? And we do all of that and then talk to the CSR. And that's where, I think is a critical link that is missing. Because if a CSR today invests in a for-profit company, they don't get the benefit. But my point is that if I'm able to do an agri-bond with Arindam and the farmer productivity goes up, why should Nestle or Kellogg or Unilever not say that coupon I'm ready to pay, because I'm really incentivizing the farmers to become more productive? Or why should J&J not pay if I'm able to do women's empowerment and train them? So that, I think, is the critical piece. Why I'm not trying to eat or swallow into an NGO pie, and we're happy to, we've done half of our bonds with NGOs, but we are the first in the world to start impact bonds with for-profit companies. And it's not easy, because it's not apples to apples. They are not able to get the money directly, and it's complicated. But it's such a simple process if we are able to declutter the regulatory paradigm.
Right. Thanks, Royston. Arundam, let me come to you. And your name was mentioned a lot by Royston, so maybe you want to join those dots for us also. But just to also talk about your work in Rabobank, and again, just trying to understand how you look at the ESG stroke SDG sort of lens in the way you go about the work that you do at Rabobank. How do the two get integrated in thinking and on the field?
So, Shankar, to put it bluntly, we don't have a choice. I mean, from a risk perspective, unless we do a deep dive on the sustainability, that's the non-financial risk, the proposal is not going to get approved in the system. So how do we do it? And the crux is that it's not about understanding the business that you finance, but it's understanding the entire supply chain to see the impact that your money has on the supply chain. So for us, just to tell you what the process is, and I'm sure all banks will have to do it someday or the other, before every origination, and I repeat, every origination for every retail or corporate loan across the world, we do an exercise, or we undertake an exercise. It's called the client photo exercise. Now, what is the client photo exercise? It's an exercise by which we rate and rank that particular business on sustainability parameters, on ESG parameters. There are 20 questions, 20 topics divided into 40 questions, and each one has got a certain rating, and we come up with a rating for the potential of future borrower. Now, if it falls below a certain threshold level, irrespective of the strength of the balance sheet, we cannot do business with them. We can make an exception where they have a very strong sustainability plan to improve on the sustainability footprint. Exceptions can be made, but there are hard covenants put in for them to improve their sustainability footprint. So it allows us, all our frontline relationship managers, firstly, to imbibe the knowledge of sustainability. When they deal with clients, they have to ask those questions, get answers. Those answers have to be vetted by the risk team. The final rating is also vetted independently. And overall, at the portfolio level, because of all the granular rating and rankings we have, a portfolio gets a rating and ranking. And year on year, there are KPIs set on how we can improve the portfolio rating. There are all kinds of targets which are set there. So we don't have a choice. Now, it's because of the very firm risk management parameters which have been put in place to understand and to manage sustainability risk. Now, one of the things you dealt with are the E, S, and G part of ESG. Now, I would say, and I will stick my neck out, and I would say that, at times I'm in a very tough position working for a European bank in Asia, because they are in some ways two different worlds. So in Europe, the E part is getting extremely, extremely critical, and they are looking at it with, magnifying lenses as to what is the impact that our business, our loans are making on the environment. In India, and what has come out strongly from even what Royston has said, the S part, the inclusion part, whether it's among the worker community, it's among the people who are borrowing and all, how do we ensure access to finance? It's just because that in the journey, in the economic growth journey, parts of Asia are at a different level than most of Europe. So for us, the immediate priority is on the S part of ESG. Even if you look at most of the government circulars and the maze that Royston referred to, the priority sector norms and all, it's all about inclusion. And India rates and very strongly on inclusion parameters so far as its business or its financial institutions are concerned. You talk to any business and you ask them, how are you impacting society? Then the first thing they'll talk about is the S part of business. Look, this is how we treat our workers. This is the gender balance. This is the kind of facilities we are providing. And for our customers, we are providing, bespoke products and solutions to the poor. That's how they see CSR or sustainable business. But you go to a European corporate, they will immediately talk about the climate piece, the environment piece. So there is a difference there so far as prioritizing between E and S is concerned. But then I do not see any contradiction there, because it all depends on what is the requirement for a particular business in a particular geography, because we will have to focus on both to make it an equitable world. We don't have a choice.
Right. And I think I completely agree. What you're saying is that the balance has to be contextual, but it's not that one can be ignored. We need to look at it holistically. And I think part of, to me, the nice thing, and I use sustainability, my preferred expression is sustainability, because that gives it a more holistic picture. ESG somehow suggests that they actually can be seen separately. They actually cannot. They are so indivisible that they need to be seen together. So
these are frameworks. Frameworks. Sorry.
Frameworks. Yeah, correct. Thank you. Shreya, you have some questions for us from the participants that we could put forth. Yeah, yes, please go ahead. Why don't we take some comments and inputs from the participants and to our panelists? So would you like to also indicate who you would suggest respond? They respond, or would?
Sure. Yeah. So I have a question for Wei from Namit from World Benchmarking Alliance. The question is that climate continues to be a dominant focus on ESG in the work that you mentioned, and the S of ESG appears to be lagging. Why do you think this is the case, and do you expect it to change anytime soon in Asia? This question is for Wei.
Wei, before you respond, do you have any? Maybe you can just put a question each to all our panelists.
Sure.
And then
no problem. I'll do that. So there's one question directly for you, Shankar, in which the participant is asking what is.
I don't think you should be. I don't think I should be answering any questions. We should leave that to the panelists. But first, why don't you put the panelists' questions, and then I'll take.
Sure.
I'll take
don't fall for his. Don't let him have it.
Sure. So one question that we have is, what kind of ecosystem would Asian countries need before ESG becomes a central theme of investment? And this question is essentially for you, Royston, and for Arindam. And Wei, in the context that what do you think the ESG aspect would be more applicable in India in the regulatory space when you see that India finally starts reporting on the SBN framework? The example given is that we have the social stock exchange, which is coming in, and it also follows some ESG principles at that. So what exactly do you think would be needed to set the stage for ESG in India? So so these are one direct question to Wei, and then for the rest of the panel.
Okay, great. Thank you. Wei, would you like to go respond to
that? Thank you, Shreya. Just to make sure I get the question right, I think you said the first question is climate change remain to be a focus for SBN. So why is social missing? Is that the question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's a very good question. I mean, also interesting. I mean, climate continues to be a priority because a couple of reasons. First is climate finance does offer new business opportunities. I'll be speaking largely from a banking perspective. So commercial banks are quite keen. This is offering new market opportunities, new business development tools for them. So you see a lot of interest on that front. And again, with the green bond market developing, that's additional business opportunity, funding sources. So there's a lot of interest to understand more on the opportunity side from the banking industry. On the risk side, the push is largely, or driver is largely from the central banks. I think in this regard, again, we're seeing, especially with the the NGFS network. This is in the initial day. I mean, in the earlier years, there were a lot of deliberation on the why. Should central banks get involved in this at all? Should central bank stay with the prudential kind of traditional central bank's role, or should central bank step into this climate change role at all? But now, this year, definitely we're behind that discussion. So it's really moving into the how. So that's where you see we are, I mean, SBN and the World Bank Group overall are also observer on NGFS. So we're staying really close. Our focus is more making sure any knowledge from this largely European central bank-led network is passed on to the emerging market players. So emerging market stays relevant in this discussion and making sure the knowledge is spread, and also empower the emerging market central banks to be able to work also in the climate risk space. But what is being done is largely portfolio stress testing using the climate change indicators. This is very new. I mean, largely still UK, I mean, Bank of England was able to do that with the insurance market. I think the Dutch central bank also is doing some stress testing for their own portfolio. But emerging markets are still learning. We're seeing a lot of interest to understand more on this. So, and then why is social missing? I think that comes back to one of the questions, Shankar, you mentioned at the to start this panel, a business case. I mean, when I'm talking about social, I'm talking it more from a risk management perspective, not from the business opportunity. I think that's Royster, your role. I mean, on the social investing, more kind of using social as an opportunity to invest. On risk management perspective, we're seeing challenges for commercial banks to see social as a risk factor for their lending operations. I mean, linking to Andren's earlier comments, all the multilaterals or most developed market banks will have a ESG standards, meaning when you are lending to a corporate borrower, you'll be looking at their environmental practices, you'll be looking at their kind of labor practices, but across a lot of the emerging market, this is not the case. Banks don't look at their corporate borrowers' labor practices. Banks don't usually do human rights due diligence. This is a new concept, and they don't see a business case for that. So you could be lending to a corporate borrower that's violating basic labor laws, but the corporate borrower is paying their kind of paying back on time. They still consider good client. So the business case is not there yet. And then this again links back to an earlier discussion, Shankar, you mentioned. If in a certain country, the social labor law enforcement is not there, that means the banks don't see that as a risk. So it's a kind of an interlinked cycle that you can't just have financial institutions uphold ESG standards while the labor law violation is not published by the labor administration. So where the market is doing successfully in certain aspects, especially on the environmental pollution control side, is where we see a cross-ministry, cross-agency collaboration between the financial market regulator and the environmental regulator. Well, on the social space, this is missing.
Thank you. Rostin, would you like to go?
So I would,
any of the questions?
No, I would say, and I want to come to the point Wei made as well, and the question on S. I think it's a matter of size. It's easy for large corporates, for IFCs, for multilaterals to deal with large numbers. That's the way they're designed, and therefore it's very tedious to look at really the granular, smaller effects. So you can do a large, clean energy plant. You can do a large wind farm. And these are, easy to dimension risk. But to do, thousands of small social enterprises is a challenge. So, which is why we need an intermediary ecosystem, I'm moving to the next question. What is the ecosystem gap that exists? And the gap in the ecosystem that exists is to create an aggregating entity. And I see Grameen Impact as being one of those aggregating entities. That if an IFC says I'm ready to invest $15 million, then I can disaggregate those and give it to social enterprises, much the same way as IFC invested in Bandhan Bank, and they disaggregated it manifold and had millions of micro borrowers. We need to repurpose, reimagine the way we're looking at ESG financing. And therefore, the investor emotion, Shankar, that you talked about when you started about fear and greed are pretty much exactly the opposite when you look at SDG financing. It is about not negative emotions, but positive emotions. So how do we channel positive emotions and make that capital available to social enterprises? And which is where the point that was raised of the social stock exchange, or even Shankar, and I don't know how your good offices can push this faster, but creating even escrow accounts where CSR can be parked to become outcome funders. So that at least, those get treated as CSR, and when outcomes are met, then they can be paid out of those escrow accounts. So that we're not waiting till 29th of March to know whether this will work or not and then put money out. But that's a big pressure on CSR if they don't know if the outcome is going to be met or not. So we've been innovating and trying to make suggestions, but there has to be a policy push. And I think that is critical to the question on what Shreya asked about ecosystem. If the ecosystem needs to really now come together and support ESG and SDG financing, there has to be a congruent catalytic policy that's in place.
Thanks, Royston. Anandam?
Well, the only point, I think we have a couple of minutes left. The only point I have to add is, look, the S part, it's easier to monitor, it's easier to measure. Now, the E part is more complex, that we are still in the process of learning that how do we measure the impact on environment, or for that matter, the climate risk. Now, a lot of work is being done on that. And it's extremely important in our context in India because we are in the red zone, so far as water risk is concerned. Now, weather risk is a big risk for India's agriculture, right? So what I would urge is that environment risk and climate risk gets integrated into a financing process, if needed through regulation, as quickly as possible. But as Wei mentioned, that initially it's important to ensure that the financial institutions, especially the mainstream banks, it's also the same story here. Most of the financing happens from mainstream banks in India, right? The Indian large banks, that they have the wherewithal to firstly be able to understand the impact their financing is making on the environment and the climate, right? Once, and it's a process, it will take its own time to mature. Once that's in place, regulations need to be in place. Otherwise, we are going to look at a disaster.
I think the important, the question always is, which comes first? Does regulation come first or does behavioral change come first? And I think,
ideally behavioral change, but when it doesn't happen, you have to force regulation. We have seen it across the world. Ideally, it's the consumer demand. It's the markets which should change businesses for the better. But at times, I guess we just don't have the luxury to wait for that.
Yeah. No, I think that's one of the market failures, right? Because I think, for example, certainly in India, I don't think markets, consumer pressure, at least retail consumer pressure doesn't push the needle. Business, B2B businesses, it perhaps, but not
absolutely
otherwise.
Not retail business.
Yeah. Shreya, do you have any more questions that we could take from the participants before we continue?
No, so these were the questions that came to the participants. I think we can continue, Shankar. Sure.
Okay, thanks. So I just want to come back to you again, talking regulations, because that's clearly, a driver, and it is indeed a driver, as you said, in most of Asia. It's certainly a big driver in India. And although we can debate on which, ideally, the regulation should be lagging, but, it doesn't necessarily do that. And I think, I just also want to link this up with the point Royston made about multiple taxonomies. I think one of the questions that we all often have to deal with, and that has to be dealt with, is the whole taxonomy around what is sustainable finance, right? Because it's necessary, of course, when you're going to when you're doing a green bond or whatever, but even otherwise, even just from a reporting perspective, it is good to have some sort of a sense of what constitutes sustainable, because I think Arindra made the point that this is one of the things that is constantly evolving. And taxonomies also need to evolve. They can't be static. But I just wanted to get your sense on what has been the thinking in the Asian region on taxonomies around sustainability, around ESG, and where do you think that is sort of moving?
I think taxonomy is really a big topic, a heated topic. At least we can see from SBN perspective, and a lot of the members are quite interested in this idea. I mean, when we're talking about taxonomy, I think people sometimes will be talking about different things. For a lot of the taxonomy so far, as we see it within the SBN community, is really the green finance taxonomy. So, and then there are in this space, there's a lot of progress and there's more clarity, given some of the international organizations' work. Notably, I think two leading players is the CBI, the Climate Bond Initiative, because I mean if you look at the GBP, the green bond principle is more principle-based approach, while the CBI does have a taxonomy, kind of a detailed list of eligible activities that you can classify as for climate bond eligible activities. So it's more prescriptive approach. And then there was for some time there was a debate if it should be a principle-based approach versus a prescriptive approach. What we're seeing is there is quite a lot of interest for a more mature capital market in developed market. It seems people prefer a principle-based approach where you have other infrastructure of the capital market in place, verifications, and kind of a market is functioning properly. Where we do see a strong interest for a prescriptive approach across emerging market, where the capital market is relatively less developed, the infrastructure is not there, and regulators are more interested in having a list of eligible activities prescribed for banks. So these are the green loans. You shouldn't be adding other types of loans, call it a green loan, to avoid greenwashing. I think this is for the green finance space. And now there's more progress to clarify some of the activities may be eligible as specifically climate finance, but and then some are beyond climate finance. You have different kind of circles where it's not contributing to climate change, but that does have other environmental benefits where you can call green finance. And then the further milestone is really the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities, which expand that whole discussion. And that's based on multiple years of technical expert input. I think that brings further clarity and also is being used as an international benchmark in developing national sustainable finance taxonomies.
Yeah, I think, in some senses, the EU taxonomy is beginning to become the gold standard because there is a need for a global, it'll be absolutely chaotic if each country or each region comes up with its own taxonomy. But yeah, we got to, I guess we're all watching that space. But I just want to come to you, Royston, on this, starting with the taxonomy question, because you brought that up earlier, and just wondering what your thoughts are on that. But I also wanted you to speak to your earlier life, your Citibank days, and when you were doing a lot more of SME, working the SME space, because that's an area where this whole ESG agenda is actually very challenging, especially because the sort of business case is less evident, and MSME and SMEs struggle to survive, and then for them to absorb the whole idea of ESG becomes even more complex. So I'm just wondering, where do you see the light at the end of that tunnel in the SME space for ESGs? But first, just a bit on the taxonomy before you get there. Thanks.
So on the taxonomy, I mean, I am one who just hates hair splitting and definitions, and spending hours in 5-star conferences discussing definitions. So for me, it really doesn't matter. My point is, whatever is decided, everyone should accept across. So the RBI list of a private sector, the SEBI list, CSR list, just let's clean it up. Let's just agree on one set and then everyone agree on it. Because, and then let's focus on getting the work done. Which brings me back to the question you asked. I mean, why can't we incentivize and make it exciting for an SME to want to do something in ESG? And the reason is, if we can turn it on its head and say, because I mean, if CDC is talking $2 billion and IFC may be talking similar amounts and World Bank's talking even more, to be able to drive this just transition, why can't we make that money incentivize the SME and say, listen, if you're doing this, instead of paying 16% interest, you're paying 6. Who will not jump? So we need to, rather than force them, no, you need to report it, do this practice, say, no, you do what you're doing. But if you can do it differently and cleaner and greener and more inclusive, then, hey, your cost drops by 10%. And that someone is ready to pay for. CSR is ready to pay for, but it has to be, kosher that they can pay to a for-profit company. Or HNIs or philanthropists or donor agencies are ready to pay for, but it has to be correctly packaged, measured, and implemented. So that really is the key. Why should an SME not benefit from a guarantee from Rabo Foundation or from FMO or from DIG or KFW if they can show that this is what they're doing on ESG or on SDG, and that guarantee drops their cost of funds or gives them an outcome funding out. So I think it needs simple creativity. It's not some complicated structuring. They need to know that my life can become easier, my cost of funds can become cheaper, my products can have a wider reach if I do these 4 or 5 small tweaks. And we need to take the headache, as in my earlier life, of Citibanker or HSBC or Arindam in his bank, and translate it into language that the big multilaterals and the policymakers can understand. So that's why my hair became gray. I mean, it's not about a wisdom that you have, Shankar, which made it gray. It's about banging my head against the wall, trying to get people to appreciate how we can turn it on its head and say, incentivize the impact. I think that's the bottom line in our SDG impact bonds. Someone has to incentivize that impact, because someone else is motivated by that as well. If girls are in school, someone else should be excited about it. If mothers or women are entering the agricultural workforce, Rabo Foundation should be excited about it. If someone is reducing carbon and cutting down wood, IFC should be interested in it. And they are, but they just don't know how to translate it to that poor woman who's sitting in a forest and cutting down trees. And we are able to do that translation. So someone has to be able to do that translation, aggregation, and becomes a $500 million bond. But that aggregation is critical.
Yeah. So I think, the incentives often end up being perverse. And I mean, I often have this conversation with when I'm in an Adivasi, in a tribal area, and, they are the guys who protect the forest, but they get absolutely nothing for it. They're the ones who are going to help us get to our NDC of how much we are able to.
I must say something here. My next call is with the newest. It's a new post. It's a Minister for Climate Change in Argentina. They've created a new ministry, And he's talking about doing a South-South bond with us, where we can look at the Amazon part of the forest that comes under the Misiones province in Argentina and say, how can communities working in forests, exactly to your point that you mentioned, Shankar, about tribals who are, contributing so much to greening our world, and say, how can they be incentivized and livelihoods get generated in a sustainable fashion for them? So we're trying to see, can the tribals of India and the tribals of Argentina and the Maori tribes of New Zealand and Nigeria come together in a South-South bond. It's crazy, but we don't know, but excited.
Yeah, but just on there as an aside, you should get in touch with the Tata Steel guys. They run a program with tribal communities globally, and all the tribes you named were often part of that. They didn't have it this year, but in 2019 I was there, and you had tribes from the Amazon and you had some Maoris and Maasais and everything else. So,
wow, thank you.
You should have a conversation with them. Arundam, coming to you, and again, I just want to, just like I did with Royston, want to go back to your earlier life in NABARD, because I think Royston obviously has a lot of dealings on priority sector lending, and NABARD was principally at the center of priority sector lending, at least in terms of what one does. And I think it also feeds into this whole conversation that we've been having about regulation and regulators. So I'm just wondering, how do you see all these things coming together, and in terms of the role of the regulator? So, we talked about how regulation in a lot of the Asian countries evolves, and the starting points are different. We talked about, taxonomy and what constitutes priority sector lending, the complications of rural lending and agribusinesses, which is central to what you do, and how does regulation or how does the regulatory framework play there? Because all of them in some ways are linked with not so much with a G, but certainly with an E and an S going forward. So I'm just wondering, do all these things sort of fit in together, or are they just a very complex system and we just need to deal with them separately?
Well, that's a tough question to answer, but I think it's complex. It's a complex maze out there, as Royston keeps saying. It is complex, but having said that, let's give credit where it's due. Let's talk about the PSL norms. Now, priority sector, the way the RBI master circular on PSL year on year keeps getting modified. Now, I can say with full confidence, had the PSL norms not been there, mainstream banks would have shied away from farmer financing. Today, you have billions and billions of dollars of smallholder farmer financing portfolio with the mainstream Indian bank, the private sector banks. It's billions of dollars of funding. Had PSL not been there, they would not have done this kind of lending. They would have perceived it to be too risky. But now, because the regulatory framework is there, and there are penalties for not abiding by the PSL norm, that they have figured out a way to manage this portfolio from the origination, monitoring, or from the collection perspective to make it a profitable portfolio, right? They have put in their effort, but they have managed that. So let's give credit to the regulator. Otherwise, the smallholder farmers would have never got financing in India. So it has its advantages, but again, it's a maze out there because if you want to do different kind of structuring in India, the biggest bottleneck is, Royston keeps talking about it, we keep talking about it, that what's popularly known as blended finance solution, which is required for ESG financing or niche climate financing, where you mix non-commercial capital and commercial capital together. In India, because of separate regulations, whether it's RBI, Home Ministry, HCRA, income tax, SEBI, you name it, you simply cannot mingle commercial money with non-commercial money onshore. All these so-called blended finance solutions, they need to be done offshore. So it's a maze. If somebody tries, it's not that people have not attempted. Many development financial institutions have attempted to bring in soft money into India to provide low-cost solutions or provide high-risk taking financial solutions for nascent sectors which are perceived to be more risky, but they have not been able to. So there is a regulatory maze out there which needs to be sorted out for to enable more innovation so far as financial structures are concerned. And as Royston says, there are billions of dollars of non-commercial money globally which would love to invest in India in health, education, agriculture, if given the opportunity to do it in a manner which is scalable, which makes sense, and which is measurable. Huh?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I think we are sort of coming to the end, and I'm just going to look at Shreya to ask whether there are any more questions that we have from the participants before we start closing the session.
No, not really. I think those were the questions that we received at that time.
Right. Thanks, Shreya. So I think as we move to closure, so I think what is emerging is that, yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So as we sort of come to a closure, we have a few minutes left. I just thought that we should we understand that that regulation is a big factor, and I think we started with that, and those were pretty much in the PSL context. Also, what you said. But having said that, there is a lot of space in between where market forces, in some senses, can also play a role in pushing this agenda. But let's come to the question that we are all trying to sort of respond to. I think we've all identified a set of factors out there which makes the case for why investors need to, in their investments or lenders in the way they lend, cannot anymore ignore the ESG factors in the way they do that. So it seems to be almost self-evident, but I'm just wondering whether if we could just go to each one of you and just if you were to convince any of your people you meet or members in your network from the financial sector as to why should I even bother with ESG, what would be the arguments you think that you would make to say that it absolutely is something that makes sense? So I would sort of put that question to you. In other words, what is the business case for a financial institution to worry about this? Not your financial institution, because you have the answers to that. But I'm just saying, in general, suppose you were to go out to someone else other than in the same choir, what would be the sort of argument for that? So I'm just wondering whether we could start with you. What would be the arguments, or what would be the business case that you would articulate?
Yeah. Shankar, I used to do that a lot in the earlier days, especially in China, where we do a lot of like supporting and advising IFC investee banks to up the game on ESG side. But I don't need to do that any longer because the regulator has put in regulations. So that's regulatory requirement now. But recalling that, I think a case study could be really powerful. When we were trying to convince a bank's board to adopt the Equator principles, you may have heard this. This is kind of the international kind of golden standards for environmental and social risk management. So the board was asking the same question. Just convince me. Why do I need to do this? This is going to involve cost for us, and I don't see immediate benefit. This is not something like by doing environmental social risk management, you are bringing me additional business. It seems I just need to do more checks. I need to do more screening. So we kind of convinced the board by saying, yes, you're right. There is a cost factor to be involved, but you probably need to do it. If you don't do it this year, in the next 5 or 10 years, you need to do it. The trend is there. This is going to link back to the SDG, link back to the Paris Agreement, climate change. We all know the broader agenda is there. It's a matter of time. If you do it now, you can stay ahead of the game. You can increase your competitiveness, and then you can start to protect your portfolio on risk side. So I think, and then you can actually calculate how much cost is involved. So for you to make an informed decision. So, and just cut it short, that bank we convinced became the leading green bank in China. And they did use the green banking as a strong competitive edge for all their business decisions. They got most of the first deal on green financing in China because of they stayed ahead of the game.
Great. Thanks, Lee. That is a very good example of how one should go about doing it. Certainly a lot of lessons for me there. Royston?
I mean, I've been thinking of the earlier definition of the business of business is business and profit maximization and all leading economic theory. And yet, on 19th August 2019, 181 CEOs in the Business Roundtable said, while each of our companies serves its own corporate purpose, we share a fundamental commitment to all stakeholders and redefine purpose in a sense. So, I don't think people now need to be convinced because the billions of dollars are clearly getting, and Larry Fink's letter to, his New Year letter also talked about similar lines. I think what is important is, again, to push the agenda that we can't just touch one part of the elephant and look at only the big projects, because big change will not happen just with big companies. And I think the point you asked on SMEs is absolutely critical. If 80% of our economy and of our workforce is in SMEs, then how do we really energize them to be part of that ESG or SDG or just transition journey? And that, I think, is the critical piece that we need to move forward to. So therefore, the definition that you started your opening introduction with, Shankar, on investor emotions and the negative emotions, I think we need to change the script there and say there needs to be a focus on positive emotions to invest. And those have to be changed for good, and that will help us to build back better, cleaner, greener, and more inclusive.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Royston. Arinder?
Well, my short answer would be more blunt. I mean, if I find a financial institution which is not looking at its investments from a ESG or a sustainability lens, I'll say that you are a business organization which looks at quarter-on-quarter profit. Have you ever thought that whether you will survive 10 years down the line? Does your board members, are they concerned about the long-term viability and sustainability of your organization? Or are they only bothered about quarter-on-quarter returns? It's as simple. If you need to survive for the next 10 years, you don't have a choice.
Yeah, right. Thank you. So in fact, my last job was as the head of sustainability for the Tata Group. And for us, this question wasn't asked because we survived 150 years by being a very responsible business. So for us, it was self-evident, but I still had to make the case in my consulting days. And I think it was pretty much the same arguments. But I think what I found very interesting is, how people see costs and investments differently. And it's the same thing. If you look at it in the short term, is a cost, and if you look at it in the long term, is an investment. And
absolutely.
And I think it's just about. So that used to be my phrase. Are you looking at the short term, or the point that you made, or are you looking at the long term? If you're looking at the long term, everything that is a cost, the question that the board asked you, why am I incurring these costs? It's not a cost, it's an investment, right? So that's what makes all this work. And if it's true for companies, it's true for the financial sector as well. So thank you, all three of you. It's been a wonderful conversation with all of you. Some fantastic insights, which I wouldn't even dare summarize. There was so much of richness, but I'm sure a lot of that has been recorded. And Shreya, I hope there is some sort of a proceedings that would come out of it, which you can share with all of us in terms of what were the amazing insights that came out. So thanks all of you very much. Look forward to a face-to-face chat sooner than later this year. Until then, stay safe and stay healthy. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Shankar. Thank you,
Shankar. Yeah.
Shreya, over to you.